Good evening, this is the news from ITN. Tonight's headlines. Government under more pressure over arms to Iraq affair. Threat to British farmers in new world trade row. Security clampdown in Belfast after betting shop killings. And the Princess meets the Beatle in France. Labour has tonight increased the pressure on the Prime Minister over the arms for Iraq affair. The Shadow Trade Secretary Robin Cook says he'll produce more evidence tomorrow implicating Mr Major. The leader of the Liberal Democrats, Paddy Ashdown, said that the integrity of the government is now in question.
The Liberal Democrats have been pressing for an emergency Commons debate on Matrix Churchill tomorrow. That's been turned down, but they're not giving up.
It's inconceivable to me that we can go on in this way without a debate. The inquiry will take many weeks before it reaches its conclusions. Meanwhile, the pressure on the government will become more and more intense. There will have to be a debate very soon.
No debate yet, but a clutch of cabinet ministers have been defending the government. Tony Newton, who himself visited Iraq in 1989 as a trade minister, denied government policy had been changed.
But if you're asking me specifically whether I went to Iraq on any other basis than an understanding that we were not our policy was not to export arms and arms-related equipment to Iraq, then that is the case.
Transport Secretary John McGregor found himself diverted away from the economy. He faced claims that the government was fundamentally corrupt.
This is not a fundamentally corrupt government. We have to deal with a lot of difficult issues all the time, but I absolutely reject that allegation.
Labour will produce fresh evidence tomorrow, which they believe implicates the Prime Minister.
And what we'll be trying to prove is that when half a dozen ministers in the government knew exactly what was going on, the Prime Minister could not have been so ignorant.
So far, the government's attempts to dampen down the Matrix Churchill affair have been completely unsuccessful. John Major will have another go tomorrow night with a big speech in the city, where he'll be stressing the benefits to the economy of last week's autumn statement. But the opposition parties are equally determined not to let Matrix Churchill die away this week. Jackie Ashley, ITN, Westminster.
Reports leaked to French journalists show Britain's farmers could lose out in a deal to be put on the table at this week's crucial world trade talks. If the deal goes ahead, almost half of Britain's arable land would be taken out of production.
The warm handshakes of last week suggested that not only was the Commission reunited, but that Ray McSharry might be in a position to reach a deal with the Americans later this week. But documents produced by French officials and obtained by some French journalists imply that the figures simply don't add up. What the Americans want would mean another radical overhaul of the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy.
These documents suggest that the talks between Mr. McSharry and Mr. Madigan can be concluded on an agreement which is not compatible with the CAP reform.
Some analysts believe it's a major stumbling block. Not only French but British farmers too would suffer financially if the American demands are met.
That really is the problem, that the French government and other member state governments really cannot envisage another stab at a CAP reform, which is what they'd have to do to meet those demands.
So how would you rate the prospects for a deal?
Well, I've always thought they're pretty slim.
We are very concerned at the direction of these talks. We have, over the last months, written repeatedly to the Commission and to our Minister, and indeed to the Prime Minister, saying, yes, there must be a GATT settlement, but you must arrange for terms which do not lead to devastation of British and European agriculture.
The row over GATT is not just a question of personalities, but hard economic facts. One of which is that the Americans want changes which might mean a substantial alteration in the Common Agricultural Policy, and that could be too much for many European governments to swallow. Libby Wiener, ITN, Brussels.
The security forces are out in strength on the streets of Belfast tonight following yesterday's loyalist attack on a bookmaker's in the city. A third man died today from his injuries. 12 others are still being treated in hospital. One is said to be seriously ill.
It was clear from the manpower on the streets tonight that the security forces are determined to bring the current wave of violence to a halt. Already today, an alleged loyalist gun gang have been arrested in possession of a shotgun and revolver, just a short distance from the scene where 3 men were killed in a loyalist gun and grenade attack. One of the dead men, 72-year-old John Lovett, a war veteran, died of his injuries in hospital overnight. His sister said that he'd been killed trying to save others.
He pushed someone out of the way and threw himself on top of somebody else, which was the reason that he incurred the injuries that he did, that cost him his life.
The other two men, 50-year-old Peter Orderly and 62-year-old Frank Burns, who had been ill for some years, both died at the scene.
He suffered enough with the illness he did have without being shot. What happened to him? Just can't believe it.
Local politicians have appealed for no retaliation.
They don't know what to do to protect themselves from these kind of attacks, because there have been so many within a very short radius of where the murders took place yesterday.
The violence this weekend has brought the province's death toll for the year to 76. And for the first time in several years, loyalist paramilitary violence has outstripped that of the IRA. Tonight there's a tight security cordon around the city in an attempt to thwart any further attacks. Eric McInnes, ITN Belfast.
Britain's UN troops have been standing by to help rescue some of the 2,000 refugees trapped in villages in central Bosnia. But many of the refugees have been making their own way to safety, helped by local forces.
All day, men of the Cheshires had been on standby at their base at Gornji Vakov, ready to move out in their warriors to assist several thousand refugees, said by the Bosnian government to be caught up in heavy fighting 40 miles to the north. Waiting in the ops room for news that a local ceasefire had been declared before moving out. But the battalion commander who visited the area could find no sign of either the fighting or the refugees.
I've got to be very careful, because I do not want to be drawn into something perhaps to the benefit of one side or other, because I am actually here in a neutral capacity, simply to save lives.
The British force is now treating these requests for armed escorts with some caution. There is concern that Muslim and Croatian forces might actively try and get British armour involved in fighting with the Serbs for their own strategic ends. Late this afternoon, the first company of warriors arrived at their headquarters in Vitez. They'd been delayed by blocked roads and had spent a freezing night in the mountains. In the next few days, they start the job they were sent here to do, escorting aid convoys to the besieged towns and villages in the north. This coming week will prove whether the men and their vehicles are equal to this task. Peter Sharp, ITN.